In the previous film, we looked at two reasons why business ethics should be treated as a subject perhaps in itself. One was that all businesses have an ethos, and you find that in their mission statements, the statements of values that all companies have, for example, in their reports. And secondly, because the way company law in the UK is set up, businesses are seen to be as if they are a person, and directors have a duty to the company as well as to all the stakeholders in the company. Duties of care, which are called fiduciary duties. But today I want to discuss utilitarianism and business ethics. Remember that utilitarianism is not just one entity. So we have Benthamite, hedonistic act utilitarianism. And we have Mill's version, which is described perhaps best as eudemistic or eudaimonic rule utilitarianism. And we can explain those in a separate film. But in general terms, utilitarianism has got three strengths, particularly, I think. One is that it is empirical. It's an attempt to bring science into ethics. And so we can test objectively for the moral good. And we do that either by adding up in terms of hedons the amount of pleasure as a result of an action, and then we take off the amount of pain to get a kind of figure of net pleasure, or we take happiness as a bigger and a wider context, as Mill particularly argues for, and we take off any misery that may be resulting from a certain type of behaviour. So it's an empirical test that is in a sense objective. It's out there to be viewed by all of us, and it gives morality that way of being scientifically in a sense measured. And secondly, utilitarian ethics has got a strict equality principle. Bentham said, no one is to count everyone is to count as one, and no one as more than one. So the utility or the happiness of the Queen is of equal worth to my happiness or your happiness. It doesn't depend, in other words, on social status. And a third strength is that utilitarian ethics claims to be universal because it is based on universal human experience. It's a theory of rational desire. And the argument of Mill and Bentham is that everyone knows why pleasure and happiness are good, because everybody desires happiness or pleasure. So it's universal in that sense. But it has three fairly serious weaknesses. One is the integrity objection. This is the objection that Bernard Williams came up with, that we are forced, if we're going to be a strict utilitarian, to do things that we would not be happy with doing because they are things that go against our integrity as a human being. So whether we might think it's the right or wrong thing to do, to shoot one person to save the many is something that many people just would not be able to do. Secondly, utilitarian ethics sacrifices the rights of the few for the benefit of the many. And this is the example that Williams gives of Jim and the Indians. So you sacrifice the one Indian to save the 19. And it's therefore a theory that simply has no emphasis on individual rights. Rights, said Bentham, is nonsense on stilts. And thirdly, and perhaps the most serious objection of all, is that it's impossible to calculate all the consequences, either short-term or even long-term, of any particular behaviour. And I'm going to illustrate this with reference to a particular business studies case. It's the case of Ford Pinto. And in 1968, the Ford Motor Company decided to design a new car, the Ford Pinto, but it rushed the production of the car, which normally would take something like 43 weeks. They managed to do it in 25. And in order to make sure that the boot was big enough to take a set of golf clubs or a reasonable amount of shopping, they moved the position of the fuel tank. One of the consequences of that was that when you shunted a Ford Pinto from the back, it was liable to burst into flames. It's a very serious design defect because the fuel tank was too close to the back end, and therefore it was liable to explode into flames. And it became clear that that was a design defect, and so Ford was faced with the option of recalling the Ford Pinto or with continuing secretly to produce it with a design defect. And they did a calculation, and they worked out that the likely number of deaths was about 180 a year, about the same number for serious injuries, and that compensation claims that would result from this would be equal to around $49 million. But the cost of a recall was something of the order of $137 million because of the major, for the number of cars and the major alterations perhaps that would be required to make them safe. And so the net loss if Ford actually did the recall was $88 million. That is $137 million minus $49 million. They decided therefore not to go ahead with the recall. Now the trouble with that position is that you can't really determine how much compensation the courts are going to award. And indeed, when it came to it, the compensation claims were way above the $49 million that Ford had estimated. And moreover, there was a serious consequence for company reputation for safety, which in a sense is difficult to calculate because you can't really translate that easily into future sales or lack of sales if you upset your reputation. And Ford came up with an interesting defense that they were encouraged in company law to think like this because governments have to have a value on a human life for social policy. But it illustrates quite well how, if you apply utilitarian ethics, you can come up with very unethical results.